The doctors told him 2 weeks before the show that it could kill him. He walked onto the stage anyway. Sharon Osbourne would later say her husband knew, somewhere underneath the tremors and the pain and the wheelchair he could no longer hide, that this was the last time, not the last tour, not the last album, the last time, period. And still, on a July afternoon in Birmingham, England, in the city where he was born, Ozzy Osbourne sat in a black throne shaped like a bat, and sang one more time with the 3 men who had started it all with him more than half a century earlier. 17 days later he was gone. This is not a story about a rock star. Not really. It's a story about a boy who couldn't read, who was told by every adult in his life that he would amount to nothing, who tried to take his own life before he turned 18, and who somehow became one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet. It's a story about addiction that nearly killed him a dozen times over, about a marriage that survived things most marriages would not, and about a final act of defiance so extraordinary that even the people closest to him struggled to understand it. Before we get to that stage in Birmingham before the bat, throne, and the 76-year-old man who could barely stand but could still sing, we have to go back, because what happened at the end only makes sense once you understand where it began. Birmingham in the late 1940s was not a place that produced legends. It was a place of factories and smoke and narrow terraced houses, a city rebuilding itself out of the rubble the war had left behind. John Michael Osbourne was born there in December of 1948, the 4th of 6 children in a family that never had enough money and never had enough space. His father worked nights in a factory. His mother worked days in another one. There was no time in that house for softness, and there was no room in that house for a child who didn't fit the mold. And he didn't. T fit it. He struggled to read. He struggled to sit still. He struggled, more than anything, to make sense of a world that seemed to be constantly laughing at him. Undiagnosed dyslexia turned every school day into a quiet humiliation. Teachers called him slow. Other children called him worse. What almost nobody around him understood in an era when these things went unspoken was that he was also being sexually abused by older boys at school, a wound he would carry silently for decades before he ever found the words to describe it publicly. By his early teenage years, he had already tried to end his life, more than once. He would later describe those years not as sadness, exactly, but as a kind of suffocation, the sense that he was trapped inside a body and a brain that the world had already decided were worthless. He left school at 15 with no qualifications and no plan. He worked in a slaughterhouse. He worked as a construction laborer. He worked, briefly, and unsuccessfully as a burglar, a decision that landed him in Winson Green prison for 6 weeks when he couldn't pay the fine for breaking into a clothing shop. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. The man who would eventually stand on some of the largest stages ever built, whose face would become instantly recognizable across the entire world, spent 6 weeks of his teenage years locked in a Birmingham jail cell, utterly convinced that his life was going nowhere. But something was happening in that city at the same time that nobody, least of all Ozzy himself, could have predicted. A few streets away, a guitarist named Tony Iommi had lost the tips of 2 fingers in a factory accident, an injury that should have ended his career before it started. Instead, forced to improvise, Iommi began detuning his guitar and building a heavier, darker, more menacing sound to compensate for what his damaged fingers could no longer do with ease. Paired with bassist Geezer Butler and drummer Bill Ward, and fronted by a wild-eyed teenager with a voice that could sound like a wounded animal one moment, and a warning siren the next, the 4 of them formed a band. They named it after a horror film playing at a cinema across the street, Black Sabbath. Nobody in the music industry saw it coming. This wasn't the psychedelic optimism of the late 60s. This was something colder, something that sounded like the factories these boys had grown up next to. Grinding, industrial, ominous. When their self-titled debut album was released in 1969, critics dismissed it almost instantly. One infamous review compared it to a night with a bad dream. But the album sold, and sold, and sold. Working class kids across Britain, and then across America, heard something in that sound that spoke directly to them. A darkness that felt honest in a way the flower, power anthems around it did not. Black Sabbath didn't just have a hit record. They had, without fully realizing it in the moment, invented an entire genre. Heavy metal, as the world would come to know it, effectively began in that rehearsal room in Birmingham, built by four men who had nothing and nowhere else to go. For Ozzy, stardom did not arrive as relief. It arrived as gasoline poured onto a fire that had already been burning inside him since childhood. The drugs came fast, then faster, then the alcohol on top of the drugs. By the middle of the 1970s, the same undisciplined, self-destructive impulses that had gotten a teenage Ozzy thrown in prison were now being fed by tour buses, hotel rooms, and an endless supply of money and access. The band that had built an empire together was slowly being torn apart by the same excess that had made them famous. In 1979, it ended. Black Sabbath fired their own frontman. The reason, according to his bandmates, was simple and brutal. Ozzy had become too unreliable, too consumed by addiction, to function inside the band any longer. He was 30 years old, and the only thing he had ever truly succeeded at in his life had just told him he wasn't good enough for it either. Most people at that point would have disappeared. Instead, within a year, Ozzy Osbourne released a solo album called Blizzard of Oz. It contained a song called Crazy Train. It became, almost overnight, one of the defining rock anthems of a generation. Ironic, considering the lyrics were essentially Ozzy narrating his own psychological unraveling in real time. He had been cast out of the band that made him. He answered by becoming bigger than the band ever was. And then came the bat. In January of 1982, during a show in Des Moines, Iowa, an audience member threw what Ozzy assumed was a rubber toy onto the stage. He picked it up. He bit the head off. It was not a toy. It was a live bat, and Ozzy had to be rushed off stage for rabies treatment immediately afterward. The story exploded across the world within days, and it cemented whether he wanted it to or not. An image of Ozzy Osbourne as something feral, something dangerous, something that ordinary rules did not apply to. The Prince of Darkness. It was a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. Half myth, half warning label. But behind the myth, in hotel rooms and tour buses that the cameras never saw, a woman named Sharon Osbourne was watching a man slowly killing himself, and she made a decision that would end up defining both of their lives. Sharon was the daughter of Black Sabbath's former manager. She understood the music industry. She understood addiction, and increasingly she understood Ozzy better than he understood himself. In 1982, the same year as the bat incident, they married. It would become one of the most scrutinized, most chaotic, and against every conceivable odd, most enduring relationships in the history of rock and roll. Because what followed was not a fairy tale. It was decades of relapse, of Sharon finding him unconscious, of interventions that failed and rehab stints that didn't take, and moments so dark that even people close to the family assumed the marriage, or Ozzy himself, would not survive them. There were affairs. There was a night in 1989 when Ozzy, blacked out on drugs and alcohol, attempted to strangle Sharon. An incident so severe that she pressed charges before ultimately dropping them and pushing him into treatment instead. Most people who study addiction and abuse will tell you relationships do not recover from a moment like that. Theirs, somehow, did. Not without decades of consequences, and not without Sharon carrying wounds she rarely spoke about publicly. But they stayed together, raised a family together, and built an empire together. That's the part of the story most people don't know exists at all, because most people only know the version of Ozzy Osbourne that arrived on their television screens 2 decades later. And by then, the story looked completely different. In 2002, a cable network called MTV took a gamble on a documentary-style reality show following the Osbourne family in their Beverly Hills mansion. The idea seemed almost absurd on paper. The same man who had bitten the head off a bat, who had been arrested, who had nearly died from addiction more times than anyone could count, was now going to be filmed shuffling around his kitchen in slippers, mumbling at the television, and struggling to operate a universal remote control. The Osbournes became a phenomenon. Ozzy, Sharon, and their children Jack and Kelly were suddenly not rock royalty or horror movie mascots. They were improbably one of the most beloved families in America. Audiences who had spent 30 years being told to fear Ozzy Osbourne now watched him get flustered, trying to get his dogs to stop barking. The Prince of Darkness had become, somehow, the world's most unlikely sitcom dad. The show would run until 2005, and it introduced an entirely new generation to a man they had never known, as a musician at all. Underneath the comedy, though, the family's private struggles continued. Ozzy relapsed repeatedly during and after the show aired. Kelly Osbourne would later speak openly about her own addiction issues developing in that same environment, and Ozzy's body, pushed for 3 decades through addiction, physical abuse, and a lifestyle designed to destroy it, was beginning to break down in ways that no amount of television charm could hide. In 2003, doctors diagnosed him with Parkinson's disease. He did not tell the world. For 17 years, Ozzy Osbourne carried that diagnosis privately, continuing to tour, continuing to record, continuing to perform in front of audiences who had no idea that the tremors they sometimes noticed weren't just the aftereffects of decades of substance abuse. They were a progressive neurological disease slowly tightening its grip on his body. He didn't reveal it publicly until 2020, sitting beside Sharon on Good Morning America, finally explaining to the world what had actually been happening to him for nearly 2 decades. By then, the disease had already been joined by degenerative issues in his spine, the result of a serious fall at his home in 2019 that required emergency surgery and left him unable to walk unassisted. More spinal operations followed. In 2023, Ozzy made the announcement that fans had been dreading for years. He would no longer be able to tour. His body, quite simply, would not allow it. For most artists, that would be the end of the story. A quiet retirement. A farewell statement. A slow fade from public life. Ozzy Osbourne had one more chapter left, and it would turn out to be the most extraordinary one of all. In July of 2025 in Birmingham, the same city where a struggling dyslexic teenager once sat in a jail cell believing his life was already over, Black Sabbath's original lineup reunited one final time for a concert called Back to the Beginning. Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, Bill Ward, and Ozzy, 76 years old, unable to stand for more than a few minutes at a time, wheeled onto the stage and lifted into a black throne built specifically so he could perform sitting down. Doctors close to the family had reportedly warned him, only 2 weeks earlier, that attempting the show at all could kill him. He did it anyway. For those final minutes on stage in front of a crowd that included musicians from across the world who had traveled simply to witness it, Ozzy Osbourne sang. His voice, ravaged by decades of abuse and disease, still found something in those songs that connected instantly with everyone in that arena. It was, by every account from people who were there, less a concert than a farewell. An entire life, an entire career, an entire impossible journey compressed into one final performance in the city where it had all started. 17 days later, on the morning of July 22nd, 2025, Ozzy Osbourne suffered a cardiac arrest at his family's home in Buckinghamshire, England. He was flown by helicopter to Harefield Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. He was 76 years old. His family's statement was simple. He was surrounded by love. His death certificate would later list the cause as an out of hospital cardiac arrest, brought on by a heart attack, complicated by the coronary artery disease and Parkinson's disease he had lived with for years. A week later, thousands of people lined the streets of Birmingham as his funeral procession passed through the city, following the same roads he had walked as a boy who was told by nearly everyone around him that he would never become anything at all. What makes the story of Ozzy Osbourne so difficult to categorize even now is that it refuses to fit into any single narrative. He was, at various points in his life, a victim and a monster, a genius and a wreck, a devoted father, and a man his own children have spoken about with real pain. He helped invent an entire genre of music, and he nearly died from the same self-destruction that fueled it. He terrified a generation of parents, and then he became one of the most disarmingly ordinary father figures ever put on television. He hid a devastating diagnosis from the public for 17 years, and then, when his body was failing him completely, he chose to walk directly toward the risk of dying on a stage, rather than let his story end quietly in a hospital bed. Maybe that's the truest thing anyone can say about him. Ozzy Osbourne spent his entire life being told what he could not survive. Poverty, dyslexia, prison, addiction, a band that cast him out, a disease that was slowly stealing his body. And every single time he found a way to walk back out onto a stage anyway. He didn't get the quiet ending. He got the one he chose. What do you think made Ozzy Osbourne's story resonate with so many people who never even listened to his music? Was it the chaos, the reinvention, or